Venice Beach, California, August 14, 1970, exactly 4:30 p.m. The air was thick with the smell of salt, cheap tanning oil, and the metallic tang of rusted iron. This wasn't an exhibition or a choreographed movie set behind studio walls. There were no lights, no directors, and no safety nets. Only one rule mattered: no gloves, no rounds, and absolutely no cameras allowed in the circle. A verbal agreement was made that what happened in the sand stayed in the sand. In less than 10 seconds, a $1 million career was nearly erased before it even began. This is the story that the Iron Elite tried to scrub from the history books. I have spent 30 years covering the underground combat scene and the golden era of California bodybuilding. I have sat in the back booths of diners with the men who were actually there when the cameras were off. I don't care about the movies. I care about the physics of what happened in the shadows. My world is grounded in the cold reality of the gym floor, and that reality tells a very different story than the one on the silver screen. It all started 48 hours earlier, inside a cramped back alley weight room. The question that hung in the air was simple: why would the most famous martial artist in the world risk everything against a man twice his size? In the late summer of 1970, Venice Beach was the undisputed mecca of physical perfection. It was a world of giants, a place where status was measured in pounds of raw meat and the circumference of a bicep. It was a culture built on the gilded wall, the belief that if you built enough muscle, you became a fortress. You became untouchable. Enter Bruce Lee. At the time, he was a man between worlds, weighing barely 135 pounds. To the giants of Gold's Gym, he was an anomaly, a little man claiming to possess the power of a locomotive. He didn't look like a threat, and that was his greatest weapon. The tension peaked when a 250-pound rising star of the bodybuilding circuit, a man we'll call the Titan, publicly mocked Bruce's training. The Titan was the physical embodiment of the era's ego. He was explosive, temperamental, and possessed what the judges called an invincible physique. He watched Bruce performing a series of rapid, short-range movements with weights that looked like toys compared to the iron plates the bodybuilders were throwing around. The Titan laughed. He called Bruce's movements dance steps for children. He told the crowd that all the speed in the world didn't mean a thing if you didn't have the mass to back it up. The affront wasn't just personal, it was a clash of civilizations. It was the Western obsession with mass versus the Eastern mastery of internal pressure. Bruce didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stopped his workout, wiped the sweat from his forehead with a small towel, and looked the giant in the eyes with a calm that felt chilling to those standing nearby. He offered a simple, quiet invitation. Your muscle is a coat. Let's see if it's bulletproof. 48 hours later, a private meeting was brokered behind the Muscle House gym. This wasn't a public spectacle. The invitation was limited. The tribunal consisted of 3 elite powerlifters and a skeptical gym owner who acted as the only witnesses. These were men who lived by the code of the iron. They weren't impressed by Hollywood stardom. They were men who valued the no-bruise pact, a goal of internal displacement rather than external scarring. They wanted to see if the legend was real, or if it was all just clever editing and camera angles. The gym owner, a man known as the Bridge, was the one who set the terms. He respected both worlds, but knew that only one man could leave that circle with his reputation intact. He looked at the 250-pound Titan and the 135-pound Bruce. The contrast was almost comical. It looked like a grizzly bear preparing to swat a house cat. The rules were brutal in their simplicity, the static exchange. Neither man was allowed to move their feet. It was a test of pure impact and pure absorption. No dodging, no retreating. The Titan would get one clean shot at Bruce's core, and then Bruce would respond. The skeptic, an old-school powerlifter who believed Bruce was all TV magic, stood to the side, arms crossed over a chest that looked like it was carved from granite. He was the cynical lens the room needed. He expected to see the little man folded in half by the first blow. He wanted to see the illusion shattered. The air in that secluded sandpit at dusk was heavy with the scent of salt and ego. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the sand. The Titan stepped into the circle first. He moved with the heavy, confident gait of a man who had never known physical defeat. He took his stance, his feet digging deep into the cool sand. He breathed in, his massive chest expanding like a bellows, his muscles rippling under a thin layer of sweat. He looked at Bruce, who stood perfectly still. Bruce wasn't tensed up. He wasn't bracing in the way a normal man would. He looked relaxed, almost hollow. His eyes were locked on the Titan's, not with anger, but with a terrifyingly focused neutrality. The Titan wound up. It wasn't a jab or a quick strike. It was a full-force, haymaker-style punch aimed directly at Bruce's solar plexus. He put every pound of his 250-pound frame into the blow. He wanted to end the conversation right then and there. He wanted to prove that mass was the only truth in the universe. The sound of the impact was something the witnesses would talk about for decades. It wasn't the sound of a fist hitting flesh. It was a deep, dull thud, the sound of a sledgehammer hitting a heavy tractor tire. For a split second, everything stopped. The wind seemed to die down. The witnesses held their breath. They expected Bruce to be launched backward, to collapse into the sand, gasping for air. But then, everything shifted. Bruce didn't move. His feet didn't slide an inch. His body absorbed the shock, rippling for a microsecond as the energy traveled through him and into the ground beneath his feet. His expression never changed. His breathing remained rhythmic and deep. The Titan's hand was visibly shaking. The recoil of hitting something that felt hollow yet unbreakable had sent a shockwave back through his own arm. He looked down at his fist, then back up at Bruce. The first crack in the Titan's confidence appeared right there in the silence of the sand pit. He had delivered a blow that would have broken the ribs of any other man in that zip code, and yet the man in front of him hadn't even blinked. The skeptic stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. He claimed Bruce must have used a trick, that he must have braced himself against some hidden support, or that the Titan had pulled the punch. He couldn't accept what his eyes were telling him. He demanded that the exchange continue. He wanted to see the invisible needle try to penetrate the gilded wall. Bruce remained silent. He simply adjusted his stance, placing his fist exactly 1 inch away from the Titan's massive chest. The witnesses moved closer, their skepticism now fighting with a growing sense of dread. They were about to witness a demonstration of physical law that defied everything they knew about the limits of the human body. The transition from giant to victim was about to happen in less than a second, and it would be a moment that the Iron Elite would try to bury forever. The skeptic, a man whose entire worldview was built on the number of 45-pound plates he could slide onto a barbell, was the first to break the heavy silence. He stepped into the center of the circle, his shadow long and jagged against the darkening sand. "It's a trick," he spat, his voice rasping with a mix of disbelief and defensive pride. "You braced against the impact. You redirected the force into your legs. Anyone can take a punch if they know how to hide the vibration." He turned to the Titan, who was still massaging a hand that felt like it had struck a stone wall. "He's playing with you. He's all theater. If he's as dangerous as they say, let's see him generate force. Let's see what happens when the little man has to be the hammer instead of the anvil." The Titan looked down at Bruce, his ego bruised more deeply than his knuckles. He wanted to believe the skeptic. He needed to believe that his 250 pounds of raw engineered mass wasn't a liability. He stepped back into his stance, his chest heaving, his jaw set in a grimace of defiance. "Fine," the Titan growled. "Hit me. Show me this internal pressure you talk about. But if you don't move me, this conversation is over, and your reputation stays here in the dirt." Bruce Lee didn't change his expression. He didn't bounce on his toes or shake out his arms like a prize fighter. He simply stepped within the Titan's personal space, closer than anyone in that circle felt comfortable with. He placed his right fist exactly 1 inch from the center of the Titan's chest, right over the sternum. To the powerlifters watching, it looked like a joke. There was no room for a swing. There was no space to generate momentum. In the world of the gilded wall, power required a long runway. Without a wind-up, a punch was just a push. The air in the circle went cold. For 9 seconds, nobody breathed. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic crashing of the Pacific waves against the pier. The skeptic leaned in, his eyes narrowed, looking for the cheat, the hip twist or the foot slide that would prove this was all Hollywood magic. He didn't find it. What happened next didn't look like a fight, it looked like a glitch in the physics of the room. Bruce's entire body seemed to vibrate for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a swing. It was a total synchronized discharge of kinetic energy that started at his heels and traveled like a lightning bolt through his waist, snapping at his knuckles. The sound wasn't a dull thud. It was a sharp, explosive crack, like a dry branch snapping under the weight of a falling tree. The Titan didn't just stumble backward. His feet actually left the sand. For a heartbeat, 250 pounds of elite muscle were airborne, displaced by a force that shouldn't have existed in such a small space. He was propelled 6 feet back, his body folding in midair like a collapsing lawn chair. He hit the sand hard, the impact sending a spray of grit into the air. He didn't scream. He didn't even groan. He lay there, his eyes wide and glazed, clutching his chest as he desperately tried to find air that wouldn't come. His diaphragm had been paralyzed by the shockwave. The gilded wall hadn't just been hit, it had been shattered from the inside out. The transition from a dominant giant to a gasping victim happened in less than a second. The silence that followed was absolute. The skeptic's arms, previously crossed in a gesture of defiance, had fallen limp at his sides. He looked at Bruce, then at the Titan, then back at Bruce. He was searching for an explanation that fit into his world of sets and reps, but there wasn't one. He had just seen a man half the size of a professional bodybuilder project enough force to lift a quarter-ton of weight with a movement that covered less than 2 inches. The gym owner, the Bridge, was the first to move. He stepped over to the Titan, helping the massive man roll onto his side so he could finally catch a ragged, whistling breath. There was no triumph in the room. There was only a profound sense of realization. Bruce didn't celebrate. He didn't boast. He reached down, picked up his small towel and nodded once to the witnesses. "Mass is a beautiful coat," he said quietly, his voice as steady as it had been at the start. "But do not mistake the coat for the man beneath it." As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the group began to disperse. There was no talk of a rematch. There were no cameras to capture the Titan's bruised ego or Bruce's calm exit. A silent agreement, an omerta of the Iron Elite, was formed right there in the sand. The IFBB, the Bodybuilding Federation, couldn't afford to have their ideal specimen publicly humiliated by a man who looked like he belonged in a library rather than a gym. It would have derailed sponsorship deals and shattered the illusion that size was the ultimate currency of power. Bruce, too, had a reason for the blackout. He was negotiating his first major US film deals, and his advisors were terrified of him being branded as a street thug or a back-alley brawler. The Hollywood machine wanted a hero, not a man who spent his Tuesday nights dismantling giants in the dark. For decades, the details were only whispered in the locker rooms of the old guard. They became a fractured legend, told by men who were afraid to admit that everything they believed about strength was wrong. They told the story to young lifters as a warning. Don't confuse the appearance of power with the mastery of it. The physics of that afternoon in 1970 remain a testament to a truth that most people spend their lives trying to ignore. Muscle is often just a beautiful armor designed for a battle that never comes. We spend years building the gilded wall, convinced that if we are big enough, we are safe. But Bruce Lee proved that the wall is an illusion. He didn't defeat a man that day. He defeated a concept. He showed that it's not about how much you can lift, but how much of yourself you can project into a single point in time. It's about the difference between a blunt instrument and a surgical needle. One makes a lot of noise, but the other reaches the heart. The world may continue to doubt the stories of what happened on that beach. They will look at the old photos and the grainy movie clips and call it all TV magic. But for the witnesses who stood in that circle, the reality was something they could never unsee. They saw the moment the laughing stopped. They saw the moment the giants realized they were small. And the most important detail, the one that the history books always seem to miss, wasn't the punch itself. It was the look in the Titan's eyes as he finally stood up and brushed the sand off his back. It wasn't a look of anger. It was a look of profound, quiet respect. He didn't ask for a second chance. He didn't need one. What happened in those 9 seconds was real enough to change every man in that circle for the rest of their lives. In the end, the iron stayed in the gym, and the legend stayed in the sand. But the truth has a way of breathing, even when the world tries to hold its breath. Venice Beach, 1970. A day when the physics of the room just broke, and the man who didn't look like a threat proved to be the most dangerous thing on the coast.